Hello, I'm Mr. Singleton, one of the Associate Directors for Outward Academy Trust. This is your last lesson on the ecology topics. So what we've tried to do is put together a bit of a revision lesson. First up is a match up the keywords to the meanings. So these are 4 words that you have come across in the last couple of lessons that you've done. Abiotic, biotic, biodiversity and quadrat. So just on a piece of paper or just try and do this in your head, match up the words to the meanings. I will give you 3 minutes to have a look at those. Okay, you got 1 minute left. Do the ones that you can do first and then have a look at the ones that you can't do, see which makes the most sense. Okay, 30 more seconds. Think about, quad meaning 4, and what shape that would make. The word bio meaning like biology, living things. Okay, time's up. Here's your answers. So an abiotic means a non-living factor that affects where an organism lives. A biotic factor is a living factor that affects where an organism lives. Biodiversity is the number of different organisms in a given area, and a quadrat was that square piece of equipment used for sampling. Now, just thing that people struggle with or forget sometimes, you can't just put that abiotic means non-living. Okay, it's a non-living factor, and therefore then you can't just put biotic means a living thing. You have to say that it's a living factor that affects where something lives, just a bit that people struggle with. Okay, so this is just a revision lesson on all of those lessons that we've been doing. We have the challenge, which is to recall the facts from the ecology topic. Remember, those recall topics those recall facts will make up quite a large percentage of your exam. So being able to recall them facts is really useful. And the aspire is to apply that knowledge to unfamiliar questions and those exam questions that might come up. So your first lesson was about abiotic and biotic factors. And as we've just said, An abiotic factor are the non-living factors which determine where an organism lives. And a biotic factor are the living factors which determine where an organism lives. I always think about this, about if you think about some of the big cities, so you've got London upon Thames, you've look at, I'm going to go to my home city, but Kingston upon Hull, Newcastle upon Tyne, settlements were always put near rivers. Now the river would be an abiotic factor, but we always went where there's a river source or a water source, because that's an abiotic factor. Biotic factor is obviously very key. You won't want to live miles away from the nearest food source or the nearest farm, etc. That wouldn't be useful for you. And particularly if you're an animal, that's even worse. So these are the type of questions that you would get. It's usually just a tick box, which one's biotic and which one's abiotic. AQA are really, really helpful here. They always say tick one box for each factor, which, surprise, surprise, means you can't tick two boxes in the same row. But lots of students still do this. So please read the questions really carefully. Also notice at the bottom there is 2 marks for this, which means if you only fill in one box, you're probably not going to get it right and you're going to get 0 marks. So you've got to do your best and just give a shot at answering the question fully. So you would put one tick in either the biotic or the abiotic for each of those ones. I'll give you 1 minute, because I don't think you probably need 2 minutes for this one. 1 minute to decide which ones are biotic and which ones are abiotic, and we'll do the answers on the next slide. Okay, so answers. Diseases are a living thing. Who's living with the coronavirus at this point in time? They are living things, and they're going to determine if something lives there or not. Herbivores are a biotic factor. They're a living thing as well. And then temperature and water are non-living factors that would determine where something lives. If it gets very, very cold, that means probably the organism's not going to live there anymore unless it's very well adapted. So there are your answers. And look, 1 mark allowed for 2 or 3 correct. In order to get 2 marks on that, you had to get all 4 correct. I've made a Google quiz so that you can just check these through. So if you want to go down, scroll down on this and answer the Google quiz, I will give you 2 minutes to complete the Google quiz questions. Off you go. The next lesson we looked at whilst we've been off is adaptations. So these are any features which allow an organism to survive in their environment. AQA break these down on the specification into 3 different types, which are behavioural, structural and functional. Behavioural adaptations are any of the actions that an organism might take to survive. So birds migrating, that's an action that the bird does. That's a behavioural adaptation to fly south in order to get more food. Structural adaptations are the physical features which allow it to survive. I think these are the more common ones that you're asked, but you have to bear in mind that these behavioural ones and functional ones could be asked as well. Often it's like, how is this animal adapted, or it has gills to help it breathe underwater, etc. That would be a structural adaptation. Functional adaptations are the processes which an organism does to survive. It's kind of ingrained into that organism. So photosynthesis in plants would be a functional adaptation. A hard one this because difference between behavioural and functional. Well, behavioural are things that are taught or learned by the animal, and functional are the ones that aren't learned. Okay. Common question. Now you have to be careful with these, that you read the question very carefully. So this is the Arctic fox. You've seen this one before in one of the previous lessons, and it even tells you that the Arctic is very cold. Who knew? And it asks you to suggest 2 ways in which the Arctic fox is adapted for life in very cold conditions. That actually is very key. It's not asking how it hunts its prey. So you can't talk about sharp teeth. You can't talk about its eyes pointing forward, because that doesn't help it survive in very cold conditions. So all of these adaptations have to be about how it survives in very cold conditions, not about its hunting or its claws, etc. Okay, there's 4 minutes, so you need to name 2 adaptations and then say how they are adapted, or how those adaptations help it to survive in very cold conditions. I'll give you 3 minutes for this. It is something you've done before. Hopefully you can remember it, but they are common questions. Okay, 30 more seconds. Okay, let's have a look at these answers then. So 1 mark for the adaptation. So even if you've just got the 2 adaptations, you get 2 marks, and then 1 mark for how it's correctly linked to its advantage. So you can have long or thick fur or hair, which will give you 1 mark for insulation, or you see it there, it says allows keeps warm. You can have 1 mark for small ears, and that reduces heat loss, not ear loss. 1 mark for small feet, and that reduces heat loss as well. But you can't have any of this prevent sinking or wide feet. White coat for camouflage or poor emitter. Small surface area to volume ratio, that's a key one. Small surface area to volume ratio means that you reduce less heat loss. If you have a large surface area compared to your volume, then you increase your heat loss. So things like elephants, if you think about elephants having big, massive ears, that's to increase their surface area compared to their volume, which means they get rid of more of the heat. But animals in the Arctic will usually be small surface area compared to their volume. So therefore they reduce their heat loss. And then you can always have the thick layer of fat, which insulates or keeps it warm. There's a little bit extra on this one. These little animals, which are called extremophiles, pop up every so often in the exams. So make a note of them. Extremophiles are these little organisms which can live in extreme environments. And the environments they're talking about is high temperatures, pressure, or very salty concentrations. They are usually bacteria. There's some actually now that is found that they can survive in space, which is extreme environment, definitely. So extremophiles, just make a note of it. They're commonly asked in exams. Google quiz time. Go on to Google quiz. Do the next 2 questions on adaptations and extremophiles. I'll give you 3 minutes. 1 more minute left. The next lesson we did about was food chains and pyramids of biomass. This is just a quick recap because this often gets taught wrongly in primary schools. The arrows on a food chain show the energy moving from one organism to another. So if you look at my food chain below, I've got grass, and the energy moves from the grass to the cow, and then from the cow to the human, in this case Keanu Reeves. So it's just showing feeding relationship. And then biomass. Biomass is the mass of the living organisms in an area. So if you look at the food chain that I've made here, then the pyramid of biomass, you put the grass at the bottom because it's the producer, and then the cow, and then the human, Keanu Reeves in this case again. In the exams, please make sure that you do label each part or each bit of the pyramid of biomass, because people often lose out because they haven't put the word grass where the grass is, etc. So please make sure you do that. Just remember, in terms of the grass is called the producer, and then you've got the cow, which is the consumer, and then you've got the primary consumer, and then you've got the secondary consumer, etc. Again, usually quite a general exam question. Sometimes they will ask you to draw food chains. If they ask you to draw, you do not have to draw the animal. You can just write the name of the organism. You don't have to be making nice little artist pictures of owls and things. So this is just quite a simple 2-mark question. What's the name? What is the producer in there? And what is the name of the primary consumer? I'm going to give you a minute because there's a quick tick box one, and the primary consumer we've just gone through. So have a go at that. Again, common things here. It says tick 1 box. You can't tick 2 boxes. Some students forget and tick 2 boxes and don't get any marks. Make sure you read the question. Key bits where people lose silly marks in the exams. So the leaf was the producer. Any plant is a producer because it can change the chemical or change the light energy into chemical energy, and therefore makes its food from that. And the primary consumer is the first animal on there, so was the beetle, which was consuming the leaf. Onto a Google quiz, just a quick see how you're getting on. Off you go. Right, let's get on with the next one. The next lesson we talked about was sampling. Now, this is a required practical, so it's one of those ones that you might be asked a method for. So be aware of these ones that pop up quite a lot. The key bit of information is that you have to use a quadrat for sampling. That is that square grid there on the picture there. And it's usually either 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. So you get this area that you can then sample in. Now, these are the steps. This will get you 6 marks in the exam. Sometimes it's a 4-mark exam. First thing you've got to do is calculate the area of the field. So you would do the length of the field by the width of the field, times it together. So you've got an area. Then you need to produce random coordinates. So normally what you would do is you'd get onto your phone and ask it to produce random coordinates. So there's apps that will reproduce random numbers between, let's say, 1 and 50, if that's how long the field was, and they would be your coordinates. So you would go, let's say it produces a number of 27, you go 20 centimeters across, and then the next number it produced 10, you move 10 meters up, and that is where you place your quadrat. Do not throw the quadrat, and please do not say you would throw the quadrat. It's place it in a random coordinates. Once you put it down, please remember to say that you would count the number of species that you're sampling, and then you've got to repeat it. I would suggest at least 10 times. Then once you know the average of how many is in each square, you can calculate the number of organisms in the field. So that is sampling using a quadrat. Other one that it talks about on the specification that you need to know about is using a transect line. Now, a transect line really is used to show what we call succession, how organisms change from one area into another area. So it kind of tells you where plants prefer, which areas plants would prefer to live in. So this is the example I've written on here. Under a tree, you're probably not going to find many species because there's not very much light. But as you come out of there, you might find more plants because they prefer to live there. The other really common one is talking about beaches. If you think about a beach, the first part from the sea up, all right, is mainly sand and no plants. As you get further away from that, you will start to get sand dunes, which sometimes have certain types of grass in them. And then as you get further back from the sea, that away from all that salt concentration or all the salty water, then you get more bushes and then you get forests, etc. The transect line is a scientific name for saying you put a tape measure down. So you just put the tape measure across the area that you're going to measure or is going to sample, and then you place a quadrat in, like, let's say every 5 meters, and you look what type of plants are in there. You can look what type of animals are in there. I'll take it back to that beach. There are certain animals which like salty water. Like the salty water. There's certain animals which won't. There's certain animals which can live on rocks, which will be able to survive like high pressured waves pushing on them, and there's certain animals that can't. So it just kind of shows you those things. So you put your tape measure down, and then every 5 meters you might put your quadrat down and just make a list of the organisms which are in that quadrat. Then you go another 5 meters and see if it's any different, etc., etc. So that is a transect line. It's a tape. This is a 4-mark question using quadrats. How would you estimate the population of a dandelion plants on a field? Just tell me how you'd use it. It's 4 marks. Bit more of a long answer question, so I will give you 4 minutes for it. Off you go. You've got 2 more minutes to think about them 4 steps that you need to do. So you've got to place it randomly. If you talked about random coordinates, that's your mark. You've got to say you repeat it 10 times or at least more than 5. That will give you a mark. You've got to say that you would count the number of that dandelions in each quadrat, and then the equation you would use is how many you had, the mean number, times by the area of the field. Okay, so there are the 4 marks. Google quiz time, just to double check that you're happy with all those. I'll give you 2.5 minutes to complete your Google quiz. Okay, 30 more seconds. So not so long ago we did a lesson about the carbon cycle. Now the big thing about the carbon cycle is to remember those processes. Think about the carbon dioxide in the air, in the atmosphere. The only way that can be taken out of the atmosphere is through plants photosynthesizing. Once the plants are photosynthesized, they can respire it back into the atmosphere, or they can be consumed by other animals. Once that carbon now is in the other animals, it could be respired out back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Or what can happen is either the plant can die or the animal can die, and it will decompose by bacteria. But once again, bacteria is a living thing, and it will respire and put that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So all living things respire and put it back into the atmosphere. Plants are the only things that can take it out through the process of photosynthesis. Sometimes the animals and plants will die, and they will die but won't decompose the same way. There won't be the oxygen available for the bacteria to live, so they turn into fossil fuels. Then we dig them up, the fossil fuels, and we will combust them, and that will also release carbon dioxide. And that is the carbon cycle. The other cycle you need to know about, which we didn't look at too much in this lesson, is the water cycle. Now, the water cycle is often done in primary school or in year 7 or year 8. If you look around classrooms when you get back into school, you might see these bags on the windows. That's the water cycle, or showing the water cycle. So just think about the water being in the sea. Well, the sun heats that up and it evaporates. So the process is evaporation, and it goes and forms clouds. Once the clouds get to the right pressure, they will release some of that water or that condensed liquid as precipitation, and that is rainfall, and that will go ends up in rivers, which generally ends up in seas. The other place it can end up, and this is why it's put into the biology topic, the other place it can end up is it can end up near plants, and plants will take up that water through the process of transpiration and release it again out through their stoma, which is in their leaves, and that's how the water can then get cycled through there. Okay, not a very difficult one. You need to remember that water evaporates, it condenses, and then you get precipitation, and it'll eventually go from rivers and streams back into the sea, and that's the water cycle. This is the general question for the carbon cycle. We've not had any water cycle questions yet. Keep an eye out for it though. So you've got all of these letters A, B, C, D, E, not E, sorry, and these arrows pointing through them, and they'll generally ask you what is the process. The other thing they could ask is just how carbon is recycled or cycled through, but I did that in the last lesson that I did for this carbon cycle. So I want you to have a look at it. It's a couple of letters basically, or a couple of processes. So what is process A, that is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into the plants? What is process B, which is taking the carbon dioxide from plants and animals and putting it back into the atmosphere? And then which process is carbon passed from one organism to another? So which letter basically is that's one is asking for. I'll give you 30 seconds because it's 3 questions, but it's A, B, or A, B, and then giving some letters. Okay, so A was photosynthesis. That is the process that plants do to take it out of the atmosphere. B, what animals and plants do to put it back in, is respiration. And then you just had to talk about, I'll just write C for which process is moving the carbon from plants into animals. Google quiz. Have a go at the Google quiz. Not too many questions in there for you. Off you go. Okay, so we looked at a couple of human issues. Before that, we need to know what biodiversity is. So biodiversity is the number of different species in a given area. The good thing about biodiversity, if the biodiversity is high, that means that there's lots of different species living in an area. That generally means that there's very little pollution. So environmental biologists will often use this as an indicator to look at pollution levels. Basically, it means that if lots of different species can live there, then there's very little strain on those organisms, which means then there's very little pollution. So a high biodiversity is very, very good. A low biodiversity, like only one or two species living in an area, that generally indicates that there's something wrong with that environment. And environmental biologists then will look at what is actually happening in that area. We talked about deforestation, and that's the cutting down of trees, generally to make way for things like buildings or for farming and quarrying and things like that. We talked about global warming. You have to know the greenhouse gases, so you have to know about methane and water vapor and carbon dioxide, and they make that blanket of gas, which blanket of gas is around the atmosphere, which then means that the sun's rays can't escape as well, and it warms up the earth, leads to melting of the ice caps, more localized flooding, more extreme weather, etc. There are three different types of pollution that we looked at. So there was sewage and fertilizers, that's water pollution, so people just dumping their waste into the water, making pollution, and excess fertilizers being dumped into like ponds and things like that, or running off into ponds and that causes the algae to bloom and then stops any sunlight getting into that pond, which kills the plants underneath. That's eutrophication. There's air pollution, so any smoke, carbon particulates, and acid rain. So when we burn fossil fuels, we release sulfur dioxide, which then forms with the water vapor, making sulfuric acid, which makes acid rain, which isn't good for lakes and forests. We had land pollution, big, massive on this now. Talking about landfill, real issue. We get all this, we get our bins picked up every 2 weeks. And where does it go? It just gets put in a big hole in the ground and then filled back up again. Well, that's going to eventually run out. And toxic chemicals as well. Peat bog areas we talked about. So these decaying areas of land, and when it's dug up, it releases carbon dioxide. People use it for fertilizers and things like that. So they're the bits that you have to remember from those human issues. And then we also talked about maintaining biodiversity, which was the last one, the last lesson that you've just done. So you have to remember these 5 here. So we're trying to breed, we're trying to, the Yorkshire Wildlife Park, I live quite close to it. We're trying to get these lions, polar bears actually breeding with other polar bears in other zoos to try and keep the breeding going so we get this high biodiversity and these animals don't die out. So protection, we're trying to protect animals, what we call in situ, where they actually live. So if you go to Africa, they will have protection areas for rhinos to stop poachers coming into those protection areas. The reintroduction of field margins and hedgerows, farmers were cutting down hedgerows because it was land that they could have used for growing more crops, but the government are now giving people money to have those hedgerows in because it allows birds to nest, it allows hedgehogs, etc., those types of animals. Less deforestation is an obvious one. You keep those habitats there for animals, and also trying to recycle a lot more. Go back to when I was a kid, there was not a recycling bin, and very few people recycled. So now we're trying to do something about that by having recycling bins picked up every other week to reduce that landfill. This was a question maybe 2 years ago in the exam, and again done pretty badly because people didn't read it and it said tick 2 boxes and they didn't tick the 2 boxes. So Manchester began a City of Trees project. The council wanted to plant about 3 million trees over the next 25 years. The trees will be planted to make woodlands larger, make new woodlands, and then try to plant them in parks and streets and people's gardens, etc. So the first question, and it's in bold, how will the trees benefit the people in Manchester? Tick 2 boxes. So please only tick 2, but do tick 2. And then the next one is how do the trees benefit the environment in Manchester? Tick 2 boxes. Bit of process of elimination here, guys. So in that first one, how will the trees benefit the people living in Manchester? Hiding road signs is not a good thing because the road signs are needed there. So I'll give you 30 seconds. Have a look at those. Tick 2 boxes for A, or pick 2 boxes for A and pick 2 boxes for B, and see what you can come up with. Okay, let's go through these answers. So, the way it will help people in Manchester was by helping people relax outdoors and reducing noise pollution. And the way it helps the environment was making new habitats for plants and animals and providing a resting place for migrating birds. A very, very quick Google quiz, one question there just to complete, and then the lesson is done. I've not done any revision cards on this one because hopefully you've started making notes through the other lessons, or if you want to make any notes, go back through and make notes. I've just put down the key bits of information for you. So once you've done the Google quiz, that is it, and well done.